With an undefeated season and third national championship now under her belt, is Dawn Staley on the Mount Rushmore when it comes to women's college basketball coaching history?
You are Locked On Gamecocks, your daily podcast on the South Carolina Gamecocks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Gamecock Nation, and welcome back to the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I'm Andrew Lyon, the host of this podcast, and also a staff writer for Gamecock Digest over on Fan Nation. Thank y'all so much for making the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first listen or watch for your team here today. We are free and available both on YouTube and wherever you get your audio podcasts daily. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Hope y'all are having a great Wednesday morning and afternoon so far, or whenever you are listening or watching today's show. We got a lot to dive into. We're going to talk about an interesting conversation regarding Dawn Staley's standing in women's college basketball history to start the show, and then we'll dive into some recruiting, some transfer portal recruiting for football. Could Chamberlain of the Gamecocks be in the game for a former five-star cornerback out of the state of Florida? And Lamont Paris once again lands a big fish out of the state of South Carolina in the high school ranks in Cam Scott. We'll talk about the impact of that and his game later on in the show. But let's start off with Dawn Staley. Now, this conversation probably would have been best to be had this past week, not long after South Carolina had capped off their 38-0 undefeated season and won the national championship, the third that the program has now won in program history. But I got to thinking yesterday about a conversation that I had on this show back on February the 23rd. Now, to save y'all the trouble going back and looking for that show, on that show, I talked about where Dawn Staley currently stood amongst the all-time greats in women's college basketball coaching. Now, obviously, when you talk about the all-time greats in that sport, you have to start the conversation with Geno Auriemma and Pat Summitt, and those are your top two. But behind those two, it's a little bit more murky because there's a lot more coaches. Now, at that time, before the postseason had began, I had Tara VanDerveer and Kim Mulkey essentially rounding out the Mount Rushmore of women's college basketball coaching history, and I had Dawn Staley 6th overall on my all-time ranking behind former Notre Dame coach Muffet McGraw. Now, South Carolina, of course, has now secured an undefeated season and another national title, so with that bearing in mind, where does that change at least my personal ranking? Well, I certainly think with a third national title, Dawn Staley has officially surpassed Muffet McGraw on the all-time list. I hate to say it, still cannot put her ahead, of course, of a Geno Auriemma or Pat Summitt. I also still think that you can't put her ahead of Kim Mulkey because Kim Mulkey's won 4 national titles, and I believe she's been to as many Final Fours or 1 or 2 less Final Fours than Dawn Staley, and so you do have to give Kim Mulkey a slight edge in that regard. Also, Kim Mulkey does possess an undefeated mark in her coaching career like Dawn Staley, and she had to win 40 games in that respective season to accomplish that goal. And so, Kim, you got to give a slight edge to. The one coach where I think you could make the argument that Dawn Staley has surpassed her as well and maybe puts herself on the Mount Rushmore because of this is Tara VanDerveer. That's really the biggest conversation with this entire topic. And with that debate, you're basically going on one of two sides. If you say Dawn Staley should be put ahead of Tara VanDerveer, then you are essentially awarding national titles in a shorter amount of time. Think about this. Tara VanDerveer coached 46 seasons overall in her college coaching career, plus 1 season with the United States women's national team. Dawn Staley has coached 24 total seasons. Tara VanDerveer, as good as she was throughout her career at Stanford, it took up until 2022, 2 years ago, for her to finally secure her third ever national title with the Stanford Cardinals. Now, you could also argue that Tara VanDerveer has had a tougher time recruiting kids to Stanford, maybe compared to Dawn Staley at South Carolina, because Tara coaching at a place like Stanford, obviously, the academic side of things, in terms of requirements, it's a little bit more stringent, which narrows the pool of talent that you could potentially go after, because they're very serious about that. Not to say South Carolina's not serious about academics, but again, compared to Stanford, who I would say likes to tout themselves as the Ivy League of the West Coast, it's a little bit different over there. And plus, Tara VanDerveer, I'm sure she was a good player in college, but probably nowhere near as decorated as Dawn Staley was in her college and professional playing careers. Now, on the other hand, obviously, you make the argument for Dawn Staley. 3 national titles in basically half the time, 24 seasons as a college head coach. And sure, she might not have the all-time wins record like Tara VanDerveer does, but if you look at the average win total per season between both coaches, the gap is really not that big. Tara VanDerveer, for her entire coaching career, including her time at Idaho, averaged 26.4 wins per season as a college head coach. Dawn Staley, at this point in her career, is averaging 25.5 wins per season. So basically, 1 less win per season on average compared to Tara VanDerveer. And I say that to say this. It's easy to give Tara VanDerveer the nod simply because of sustained success over a very long period of time. And you do have to give her props for that. It is probably something that few people are going to see happen in this sport ever again. And if it weren't for the fact that Gino's going to coach a couple more years, she would probably own the all-time wins record in all of college basketball, men's or women's. But if Dawn Staley had the same amount of time coaching applied to her career, she would be right there with Tara VanDerveer. So my point here overall is I don't think that it's totally fair to Dawn Staley to just hold the longevity side of things against her in comparison to Tara VanDerveer's career. And again, Dawn Staley, she played professional basketball all the way up until the mid-2000s in the WNBA, and she finished her college career in the early 90s. So she played professionally for over a decade, which certainly sort of elongated the amount of time that passed before she eventually was interested enough in becoming a college coach. The same cannot be said for Tara VanDerveer. So if Dawn Staley had gotten into coaching right out of college, then again, we would be looking at this, in my opinion, a lot differently. So could you say that Dawn Staley is on the Mount Rushmore behind Gino, Pat, and Kim, and has surpassed both Muppet McGraw, which I don't think anyone's going to argue, and Tara VanDerveer? You probably are going to get different answers from a multitude of people, but I do believe you can make a strong argument that Dawn should be placed ahead of Tara VanDerveer because, listen, I know that it's not necessarily healthy for sports for it to be all about championships all the time, but I do think something has to be said about the fact that, look, Tara, as successful as she was at Stanford, made it to the Final Four 13 times in her career, only won 3 national titles. That's not exactly a great ratio. Dawn Staley's now made it, I believe, 5 times, maybe 6 times. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong on that. And she's already won 3. And I do think that should account for a lot, or count for a lot, I should say. So, very interesting conversation. Definitely want to get y'all's opinions in the YouTube comment section or on X if you follow me over there. Now, moving on to some recruiting notes. South Carolina's football program, look, they might not be quiet throughout the next couple of weeks as Shane Beamer and his staff obviously are looking to add some more talent, add some more pieces to this roster, and they could throw their hat in the ring for one of the biggest names in the transfer portal for this spring window. We'll talk about that player in just a couple moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by Monopoly Go. We've all been there, either as a player or a fan. It's halftime and the scoreboard is not looking good. You're feeling low, not sure you or your team can pull out a win. And that's when you dig deep, lift your head up and say to yourself, time to get back in the game, pull off some bank heists, and take as much of my friends' money as I possibly can. That's right, the smash hit mobile game Monopoly Go lets you compete with your friends to get the most riches and the biggest empire. It's the Monopoly you love, but on your phone, anytime, with tons of new twists, including leaderboards to compare your progress to your buddies. And there's so much to do on the Monopoly Go app. You can play on countless dynamic Monopoly boards. You can make your friends bankrupt by smashing their landmarks with a wrecking ball. And of course, you can charge other players rent for your iconic properties. You can even work with your friends to crack open community chests in tournaments to get extra rewards and climb the leaderboard. So get back out there, put your game face on, and download Monopoly Go, now free on the App Store or Google Play Store. Welcome back to this Wednesday edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your South Carolina Gamecocks every single day. And as always, a big thank you to each and every one of you everydayers who make the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your daily choice for South Carolina Gamecock sports coverage. South Carolina's football team, look, they're not going to reel in 19 players like they did in the winter transfer portal window. But beginning on Tuesday at exactly midnight Eastern Daylight Time, the South Carolina Gamecocks have 2 weeks to set up a target board and get a few more transfers in the program that could help them at key positions. And one of those spots could be cornerback, where, as I'll discuss a little bit more in a minute, it's pretty much an open competition right now outside of one of those cornerback spots. And this leads me to an interesting piece of news that trickled out on social media on Tuesday, as 24/7 Sports national college football reporter Brad Crawford, who is stationed in the Carolinas, basically reported that South Carolina is going to kick the tires on Cormani McClain. Now, you might be wondering, well, who is Cormani McClain? Well, Cormani McClain was one of the best prospects in the entire country for the 2023 class. He was a 5-star cornerback prospect in that cycle, was rated basically a consensus top 20 prospect no matter where you look on the recruiting service websites that are out there. Now, Cormani is transferring from Colorado, where Primetime and all of them are at right now, obviously. And as a freshman at Colorado last season, he played in 9 games and started 4 of them, registering 13 total tackles, including 1 tackle for loss and 2 pass breakups. So not quite sure the reason why McClain is transferring. You could maybe say that the Dion effect wore off very quickly when McClain arrived on Boulder's campus. You could say that he's looking for a chance to get more playing time. Obviously, being a 5-star corner and going to a team like Colorado that only won 1 game the previous season and only playing in 9 of them and starting 4, that might not have vibed with Cormani McClain very well. And here's the thing. Cormani McClain, he is from Lakeland, Florida. Now, the reason why that is important is because South Carolina's defensive backs coach, Torian Gray, he's got connections down there to the state of Florida, obviously having coached with the Florida Gators on a couple of occasions. And, having spent a lot of time down there throughout his coaching career, he's built up connections in certain recruiting territories. And the state of Florida, that's basically kind of his domain out of the entire coaching staff that South Carolina currently has as presently constructed. So this could be an opportunity for Torian Gray to get back in the mix here, to basically make contact once again with Cormani McClain and see what's up. And the thing is, South Carolina, they've got something to offer Cormani McClain, which is an opportunity to play early on here in Columbia, South Carolina. Because as we look at this defense, I know that a lot of the talk over the past few weeks during spring practice has been about Dylan Stewart and Kyle Kennard and Gilbert Edmond at the edge rusher position. I know there's been a lot of talk about the increased depth along the interior defensive line and also at the linebacker position. And all of those storylines are absolutely valid. And I do think the defensive front for South Carolina's football team is going to be better this coming fall. But if there is a question mark that this defensive unit's going to have in 2024, it is undoubtedly at the cornerback position, because for the second straight offseason, South Carolina is losing at least one of their outside corner starters. This time, Marcellus Dial, who had waited a couple years in the wings behind a Cam Smith and Darius Rush for his opportunity, played pretty well this past season. Now he's going to take his shot at the NFL. O'Donnell Fortune, big return for South Carolina. He is coming back for another season. He had a pretty solid year overall in 2023. Did have some moments, however, in certain games that, quite frankly, just did not look very good. Also got into a little bit of trouble at times. Very, very minor stuff, should be noted. Obviously, we all make mistakes when we're in college and when we're young, but that was the case last year. And so you're going to obviously hope that O'Donnell Fortune, knowing that, look, this is pretty much your last hurrah in college, he's going to go out there and try to make sure that he makes as big of an impact as possible. But you got to find somebody that's going to start alongside him. And that room, it is crowded with some potential starting options. You do have a Judge Collier, who is now a rising sophomore and got a lot of experience this past fall. Kind of wound up being one of the bigger surprises out of the 2023 recruiting class, because nobody really looked at him as potentially the third guy at that outside corner spot, but that's kind of what Judge Collier morphed into. And when you see him in person, the first thing that sticks out is his wingspan. I mean, his arms are probably the longest that we have seen out of any cornerback that's been a part of this program since Shane Beamer took over. So Judge Collier, he played both ways in high school. If he can just get a little bit better in terms of, I think, anticipating other players' routes, then he could take a massive step forward this next year. You've also got Vakari Swain, obviously another two-way player of high school, great athlete, but admitted in an presser, in an interview that he did with the media a few weeks ago, I think right as spring practice was beginning, that it was a tough adjustment for him this past fall. He was not here this past spring, and then he got here and having to play cornerback full-time, he admitted it was a bit difficult at first, so maybe he takes a step forward. You've also got veterans back there like Emory Floyd and David Spalding, and then there's Jalewis Solomon, whom the Gamecocks got this past recruiting cycle. We all remember that one. Looked like he was coming here, then committed to Auburn last minute because it seemed like a bag got dropped, and then he turned around and decided, you know what? Actually, my heart still is with South Carolina, and he's wound up a Gamecock anyways. He's not here right now during spring ball, but Jalewis Solomon is absolutely a guy that's going to throw his hat in the mix once he gets to campus this summer. So the point here is this. You've got some options, but you don't have a guaranteed starter behind Fortune. And with Shane Beamer and the staff and the whole program, in all honesty, with how important this next season is for you, you've got to get momentum back in an SEC that's going to look vastly different this coming fall. So you can't take any chances. You can't just sit there and basically hope one of those guys is going to step up. And sometimes that means we've got to go in the portal and we've got to get somebody that basically we know just what he has shown, what he is on paper. He is going to make us better. And a Cormani McClain, purely from a talent standpoint, would make South Carolina's cornerback position a lot better. So be very interesting to see what all happens on that front over the next week and a half or so. Again, McClain does not have to commit before the end of this transfer portal window. He just had to be in the portal before the end of this window, and obviously he's already in the portal. So we'll see if South Carolina can beat out any other teams if they decide to go after Cormani McClain with 100% effort throughout this process. Now, South Carolina's men's basketball program, they're celebrating today because they got a humongous commitment in the form of Lexington High School star and four-star guard Cam Scott, which is just a signal of how things continue to change in terms of South Carolina's in-state recruiting efforts, and it's going to add a lot to their offense. I'll talk about that in a few moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Before I get into talking about Cam Scott, I want to talk to y'all about one of our great sponsors over here with the Locked On Podcast Network in Yahoo Finance. Wouldn't it be great if you could see all of your investment and retirement accounts in one place? With Yahoo Finance, you can consolidate your views from multiple accounts into one hub and access the expert analysis that you need to tend to your entire portfolio with confidence. I myself have a relationship with Yahoo Finance. I have stocks like T-Mobile that I keep track of on the app, and I also have an investment in a mutual fund with Fidelity that I keep track of as well. And Yahoo Finance makes it incredibly easy for me to manage all of those stocks and investments in mutual funds. Whether you're a seasoned investor or looking for that extra guidance, Yahoo Finance gives you all the tools and data that you need in one place. For comprehensive financial news and analysis, visit the brand behind every great investor, yahoofinance.com, the #1 financial destination, yahoofinance.com. That's yahoofinance.com. Welcome back to today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your team every single day in just 30 minutes. Lamont Paris and South Carolina's men's basketball program continue to turn the tide as far as in-state recruiting is concerned, as they landed four-star guard Cam Scott out of Lexington, South Carolina on Wednesday morning. This one is a little bit special for me, in all honesty, because Cam Scott played at my alma mater as far as my high school goes, Lexington High School, and they've had some great boys basketball teams over the past few years, but Cam Scott helped them get over the top and won them a state championship earlier this winter. This is the third straight recruiting cycle where South Carolina has landed a top 150 prospect from the state of South Carolina. And I'm talking about top 150, obviously, on a national scale. 2022, obviously, they got Gigi Jackson, who reclassified from 2023 to 2022. In the 2023 cycle, they got Colin Murray Boyles, who's now viewed as a potential first-round draft pick in this next year's NBA draft. And now the 2024 class, they have landed Cam Scott. Honestly, you could argue this is the most successful run on paper that South Carolina's men's basketball program has had recruiting in-state kids possibly ever. I mean, I can't not recall any other stretch in history of the program where they've done something like this. Now, if you remember the times of the 70s, the 60s, Frank McGuire years basically, and the 80s and 90s, and you can think of something, then again, please be sure to tell me. I definitely want to learn more about South Carolina's recruiting efforts in that regard. But the point here is this. Cam Scott is a humongous get for Lamont Paris and the staff, and it's not just because he's a South Carolina kid. Cam Scott is a really doggone good basketball player. You go and watch his highlights from his time at Lexington High School, mainly from this past season. It's pretty easy to tell that Cam Scott is going to really help this team out, especially on the offensive end of the floor. Cam Scott, I would say in terms of his biggest strength, it is his three-point shot. Cam Scott likes to take a lot of shots from behind the arc. As Lamont Paris has said plenty of times, I like three-pointers. Well, guess what? Cam Scott, he really likes three-point shots. And he can do a bevy of things to create some space for himself. He's got a crossover move that he'll use from time to time. Also got a step back and a little bit of a sidestep shot as well. He'll use a little bit of everything to try and create some space if he's doing it off the dribble. He also can just pull up every so often and he'll drain it as well. He's got a really nice quick shooting stroke. It's not an elongated one where he's got to gather his feet and everything before he lets go of the ball. So I don't think that it's going to be one of those cases where he goes to college and all of a sudden the shooting percentage drops off a cliff because it takes so long for him to let go of the ball. That's not going to be a problem for Cam Scott. But Cam Scott's not just a three-point shooter. Cam Scott can score at all three levels. He can take tough, contested mid-range shots, and he also is willing to drive to the basket. Something that I think is important because if we recall Gigi Jackson's time at South Carolina 2 seasons ago, what was the biggest issue outside of maybe the emotional stuff and having to basically adjust to some rough times for the team? The biggest challenge for Gigi Jackson was, offensively speaking, being willing to drive to the basket. Change up your approach Change up the way you attack a defender. If you attack defenders the same way, going from high school to the college ranks, these guys at the college level, they will adjust to that. College coaches will be able to point stuff out on film, and you face just the right opponent, they will completely negate and nullify your ability in all essence. Cam Scott, in terms of at least being willing to attack the basket, again, that should not be a problem. He has a pump fake in his arsenal as well, which is great for someone that can shoot the three ball as well as him. He's definitely going to use that a lot more at the college ranks. Now, Cam Scott also, let's go ahead and also talk about his athleticism. The best way I can describe it is Cam Scott, it looks effortless to him. Whenever he's going up for a one-handed jam, whenever he is running the floor, it doesn't seem like he's exerting a lot of energy. And I don't mean that in the sense that he doesn't give effort, because trust me, he does. But I mean in the sense that he's such a good athlete that it just seems like he has to do very little for him to almost have the very top of his head be level with the rim when he is attacking the rim on the offensive end. It's just really astonishing to see. And then defensively speaking, because obviously you got to play both ways. And if you're going to play for Lamont Paris, he's going to be on you about defense. So what can Cam Scott do on that end? Well, he can help you get extra possessions on the offensive end. Cam Scott, he was really, really good at telegraphing passes as an off-ball defender and being able to time up, jumping a passing lane, and basically intercepting the ball and going on the fast break to the other end. That was his biggest strength on the defensive side. Now, could you argue at times maybe he was ball watching a bit too much and that will bite him some at the college level? Sure, you could. And Lamont Paris and this staff, I'm sure, are going to work on that with him. And again, I'm sure that he's got a lot more he can offer on that end as well. He's 6'5", and Lamont Paris, as he proved last season, just give him some time and he'll coach you up on defense. And in return, he'll let you do whatever you want on offense. And so when you combine that with the success that this team had this past winter, I think that's fair to say that they gave Cam Scott a lot to think about over time. When he originally committed to Texas, it kind of seemed like one of those deals where he really wanted to come to South Carolina, but they won 11 games in Lamont's first year, were competitive in a lot of games, but they lost the majority of them. And again, G.G. Jackson, through a lot of his own fault, quite frankly, but also some fault, you could say, on the staff, maybe just because they weren't used to handling or dealing with a kid of G.G. Jackson's talent, he had an up and down year. And so when you combine all that, you could see why initially maybe Cam Scott was still a bit hesitant on the idea. But seeing South Carolina win 26 games, make it back to the NCAA tournament for the first time in 7 years, and then you look at Lamont Paris, how much his players seem to adore playing for him. And the fact that he got a big contract, basically a massive commitment from the university that, hey, we are serious about men's basketball here once again, and we are committed to making this a winning program. I think that all basically sold Cam Scott over a period of time and his family that, hey, you can stay home and still accomplish everything that you want to do at the college level in your dreams on your journey to try to make it to the NBA. So huge win for Lamont Paris and the Gamecocks. And it'll be a lot of fun to see what Cam Scott's going to do with Kyle Murray Boyles, another South Carolina native, and the rest of these guys this next season. Still got to get a point guard and center out of the transfer portal, but you at least got your shooting guard position figured out for this next year. No doubt about that. With that being said, that's going to do it for today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I hope y'all thoroughly enjoyed today's show. As always, again, let me know where you think Dawn Staley sits amongst the all-time greats in women's college basketball coaching. What are your thoughts on Cormani McClain potentially being a target for South Carolina's football program? And lastly, what are your thoughts on Cam Scott staying home with Lamont Paris and the Gamecocks? Let me know your thoughts down below in the comment section on YouTube, or shoot me a direct message on X at @ALion_SC. And once again, thank y'all so much for tuning in. Have a great rest of your Wednesday. I'll be sure to catch y'all on the next show of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast.